Rebonjour tout le monde. Merci encore d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Merci ou merci énormément pour Ariane pour sa présentation de ce matin. Je veux souligner que Ariane nous a aidé énormément dans l'organisation de cet événement-là. On est vraiment chanceux d'avoir développer cette amitié-là et c'est une amitié qu'on espère conserver dans le temps. Donc, peut-être une petite main d'applaudissement pour Ariane. Hein? Oh! OK. Et pour ceux qui me connaissent pas, mon nom est Véronique Miro. Je suis étudiante ici à la maîtrise à la Cité. J'étudie le colonialisme médical en me concentrant sur un pensionnat ici qui a été opéré sur le traité numéro 4. Je travaille aussi avec Dr Mélenchon sur un centre de recherche qui est en cours de développement ici à l'université en support aux équipes de recherche sur la question des sépultures non marquées et les enfants disparus. Et je travaille aussi avec une compagnie qui est basée à Payapot qui s'appelle qu'un, donc, c'est vraiment un plaisir de voir des événements comme celui-là ici se dérouler à la Cité. Comme francophone, je trouve intéressant de voir et important de voir l'intérêt des membres de la communauté, mes amis, mes collègues, pour des événements comme celui-là aujourd'hui. Et il va y en avoir d'autres. Aussi, je veux remercier May pour sa prière du matin. The Nanas Common for the prayer made this morning. We are so grateful to have you with us today. In your busy schedule, I have to say, I have the pleasure to know May for many years now. She's so involved in the community. I see her everywhere. And it's really a pleasure to have you among us today. Donc, sans plus attendre, j'aimerais présenter Dr Kathy Walker, qui est commissaire au Traité ici en Saskatchewan. Cathy, elle est nêhiyaw-iskwêw, issue des lignées métisses, saulteaux et nakoda. Elle a grandi ici à Okanese sur le traité numéro 4. Elle est une mère, une tante et kokum, grande tante, et a passé la majeure partie de sa vie professionnelle à travailler pour le gouvernement, le milieu universitaire et des organisations à but non lucratif. Cathy est aussi une de mes co-apprenantes de la langue cri. Ça fait plusieurs années qu'on prend des cours de cri ensemble. C'est une amie. Donc vraiment, c'est un plaisir de l'avoir ici aujourd'hui avec nous. Donc sans plus attendre, je vais passer le micro à Cathy. Thank you so much.
Hey. I always love it when you get the applause in the beginning. It's like, okay, I'm done. No, I'm just kidding. So first of all, of course, I want to thank May for your prayer, your blessing, starting us off in a good way this morning. And I also want to thank all of you for showing up today to talk about truth and reconciliation. I'll just introduce myself in my language. So Kathy Walker Nitsigasun, Okanese Chinia Kaete Maga Saskatoon Newigin Megwats. So I just said, my name is Kathy Walker, and I'm originally from Okanese First Nation, which is, I think, over there. Am I pointing the right way? It's east. That way? I don't know. I'm directionally challenged. I'm a very bad Cree because actually nêhiyaw means the four directions people, and I go in every wrong direction. We're supposed to have good direction, but I will always go the wrong way. Just ask anybody who drives with me. But anyway, yeah, I'm actually from the same community that May married into, so technically, we're cousins of some sort, for sure. Excuse me. And from what I could catch from the last speaker, it sounded like a really great talk. But one thing that resonated was, first of all, the book, you know, and what to put at the center, but also to know the place that we're in. And so the place, first of all, that I come from, File Hills, where May also lived and has relationships, used to be one big community, and we called it File Hills, which again was very, you know, connected to the land there, right, and the landscape. And then with the Indian Act and the imposition of band councils and that sort of thing, we all became divided, and then it became 4 reserves, with each with its own chief and council. And so, you know, that's something that we deal with now. There's, you know, at times unity amongst the 4 communities, and at other times not. But that's just one of those, you know, colonial impositions, right, that we deal with. I also want to, you know, I was just thinking about this place that we're in, and some of you may know the nêhiyaw name for this place. Does anyone know what it is? Well, I know Veronique knows. Veronique, and Veronique studied Cree, so she might be able to pronounce it even better than myself. But Veronique, did you want to share?
It's a speaking, which is mean time of bone. And you take Cree class with me, so you're even better than I am.
Well, she has a degree in Cree, so she's ahead of me. And I actually, Veronique and I tried to start our own little Cree dialogue, which I think lasted about a week before we got too busy. Yeah, but I learned a lot from her about Cree in that little bit of time. But you know, just reflecting on that name for this place, right? Naming is claiming. And so when we call this place Soskana ka asastegi, what are we claiming when we use that name? When we take the time to understand this place as pile of bones? What are the stories that name carries, right? What's the history? And it's actually, a lot of people may think that it refers to the Buffalo genocide that happened on the prairies, which is, you know, basically the Buffalo who used to roam in the millions here in this place, were exterminated by about the 1880s, where they had gone from millions and millions roaming from the Great Plains in the States up into Canada here, to, I think, about 1,000 animals. So they were just about completely eliminated. And I've heard that the wild species may actually have been eliminated, but there's like a more domesticated species that now still exists. But Pile of Bones is interesting because before the Buffalo genocide happened, or attempted genocide, and this place kind of became known as Pile of Bones because of the pile of buffalo bones that had been left over from the slaughters of the buffalo, and then they would put them on the trains and send them down east to make glue and different things, and pottery. China, I think, was made also from buffalo bones, things like that. But before that, this also was actually just a place where Cree and Nakoda hunters, and Dakota as well, came to hunt the buffalo. And one of the things that they would do is they would build these sculptures or monuments with the bones of the buffalo. And it was a way of honoring the buffalo, but also of calling the buffalo back to the place. And so there's also that history. And then when you think about Pile of Bones, there was also diseases, as a lot of you know from James Dashik's book. there was a lot of disease that swept this area, so smallpox and that sort of thing. And Nakoda people, especially in this area, were hard hit by it. And so their bones are also here with the buffalo bones. So, you know, again, in that name, there's a lot of stories. And so it is important to know the name. And language, you know, language is important, which I don't have to tell that to a Francophone community, right? Because obviously, you know, maintaining your language and culture is extremely important. And that's a big part of reconciliation. So I want to talk a little bit now about reconciliation and treaties. So obviously, we've all heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. It came out 10 years ago with its 94 calls to action. We probably know that, but I just kind of want to relate it a little bit back more to treaties. So basically, residential schools came about not as a result of treaties, but a bit as a violation of treaties. Because when treaties were made on these lands, and the treaty here was made in 1874, so about 150 years ago. And it predates the province of Saskatchewan by about 30 years. But so when the treaties were made, there was this part of the negotiations were that First Nations people wanted their children to be able to get an education, a Western education, because they saw value in that. And at Treaty 4, there was also a reference to the man who was doing the note-taking. There was a chief that said, I want my child to have the education that he has. And so that's where we also get like the post-secondary education, right to education from. And so this was what was asked for. And what they also wanted was a schoolhouse on every reserve so that their children could learn, you know, these ways of learning, but could also still be with their families and nations and still be nêhiyaw and Anishinaabe and Nakoda, right? And go home to their families after every school day. But of course, what ended up happening was the government decided to institute Indian residential schools. And it was mainly because it was seen as more efficient and cheaper, and a lot of the responsibility could be offloaded onto the churches, who also had the twin objective, obviously, of Christianizing, you know, people that at the time were regarded as primitive and uncivilized and unchristianized, and even not even really fully human, right, at the time. So treaty did play a role in that. And there was also a lot of leaders at the time, and this is also in the TRC report, who right when residential schools were first instituted, there were a lot of treaty leaders at the time who really objected to Indian residential schools, especially after some of their children had gone and they realized how brutal they were. And what ended up happening was a lot of these leaders would get deposed. They would basically, Indian Affairs had so much power by the time Indian residential schools policy was instituted because of the Indian Act and because of the disease that had happened and because, you know, populations had been decimated and, you know, and then the Northwest Mounted Police had come in. And again, too, the Northwest Mounted Police were supposed to protect inherent and treaty rights. That was part of their role, and also to protect Indigenous people from settlers. But, you know, that's not what happened. It was basically about containment, right, and segregation for a lot of generations and oppression. So really, you know, we have this treaty history that was really pushed aside in a very, like, institutional way and in terms of a policy and legislative way. And the Indian Act was really front and center. And, schools like Indian residential schools became the norm for, over 100 years. Like so many generations, right, had to attend those schools. So, but anyway, so I just wanted to start with that, like with how treaty was conceived of education and how it kind of became, how it morphed into Indian residential schools. So out of the TRC, obviously the big finding was colonial genocide, right? Cultural genocide. They couldn't say it was actually colonial genocide or genocide proper because they didn't have the legal mandate to do that. But it was basically cultural genocide. And there was these 94 calls to action that talked about the ongoing legacy of the schools, and then also what we need to do in order to reconcile this past and move forward together, like with a better relationship amongst all of us, right? So, but I just kind of want to focus a little bit on this cultural genocide, on the truth that came out of residential schools and needing to reconcile with that truth. Because, in my own family, like I said, I grew up in Okanese, and the main residential school that a lot of people where I'm from attended, and where both my parents attended, and like all my aunts and uncles, basically, and some of my cousins and stuff, was the Lebret Indian Residential School in the village of Lebret, which again isn't too far from here. And like I said, both my parents attended, and before residential school or before the TRC, I grew up really knowing nothing about residential schools at all. I was the first generation that really had the choice to not attend residential school. So, this history is not very long ago. It's actually kind of a funny story. Me and my sister actually wanted to attend residential school, but my parents wouldn't let us. We wanted to go to Lebret, but that was because by the time we were of age, it had changed. It was being run by the Star Blanket First Nation, and they had these really great sports programs. And so I wanted to go live there so I could just like live and breathe sports. And also, chase after boys I wasn't related to, because I was related to everybody on File Hills. But my parents were like, dead set against this. No, you are not going to residential school. But anyway, but it was, so growing up, the not knowing anything about residential schools was like basically not knowing who my parents were and not understanding why they were the way they were. Sorry, So I'm trying to share stories more, but I've never actually really told these stories publicly. So I'm taking a risk. So I hope you guys hold me up with some compassion. So my mother, the only thing she ever said about residential school was that she said, one thing she always said was, the nuns always called us les sauvages. And, okay, the savages, but as a little kid, you're like, oh, okay, well, that's not nice, And then another thing she told me about was how when she was older, like a young teen, a few of her friends decided to run away from residential school, and she almost ran away with them. And she said she was literally like, she had one leg on the window and was like about to leave, and then thought better of it and climbed back in. And then, so she didn't try to run away. And then she would always say, oh, I'm so glad I didn't try to run away. She said, because they caught those girls, they caught them. And then they they pulled their pants down and they whipped them. The priest whipped them, she said, and he would get tired and then he would like whip them again. But anyway, at the time, I was like, that's horrible, right? But I didn't realize either, like these were the two things that I knew. And my dad, who was a lifer at residential school, never said a word, right? So I didn't even know anything. But at the same time, they were very much impacted. And they were also already a second or third generation to attend the schools. So they had already been through, you know, their own parents attending. And so when it comes to, I guess, me reconciling with the truth of my parents' experience, even for me, like it took the stories of the survivors to really understand what they had been through. And even with my mom and her story of, you know, seeing these girls whipped, it wasn't until the story of the residential schools really started to unfold publicly. And that story, again, was a really long time coming. So back in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, does anyone remember that? RCAP studied it a little bit? Yeah. Oh, I think the final report came out in 96, but okay, well, I might have the date wrong, yeah. Oh, okay. But anyways, when that report came out, it was, one of the things that they said was, we need a national public inquiry on residential schools. And what they called it was an investigation and inquiry into the profound cruelty inflicted on Aboriginal peoples by residential school policies. And so they recommended a Canada-wide inquiry. But it actually wasn't until like 2008 with the Indian Residential Schools Agreement, after residential schools survivors had actually taken Canada to court and demanded an apology, and also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, that the truth really started to become more widely known. And even with the apology that was done at the time by Stephen Harper, I remember watching it, and a lot of people were moved by it, but a lot of people weren't as moved. But I always remember Phil Fontaine, who was the head of the Assembly of First Nations at the time, who said that, who was a survivor, and said that his experience of residential schools, he felt that it cut like merciless knives at our souls. And I remember hearing that at the apology and thinking, wow, like, you know, that's very deep, right? So anyway, again, I'm just trying to show you like my own process of trying to reconcile with this truth and really, you know, feel it and understand it, right? And this was, again, still before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and the final report came out. So I found this one poem that was written by Neil MacLeod. Anna and I were just talking about him, who he wrote a poem about the apology. And I'd say this was one of the things that really helped me to understand the full impact of the truth. And so I just wanted to share, it's a rather long poem, but I just want to share some excerpts of it from you. And this is his response to the apology. And the poem's called Elle, we wear it. And so I'm just going to read the excerpt now. So he said, in front of all, the métisses were whipped. Nipaysasak is boys were whipped and slapped with heavy belts until the bodies were clothed with deep, heavy blood from inside their skin. Cuts on their skin became railroad tracks upon their territory. Horses of old eternal lakes became blind, unable to move. They became cold and quiet. The priests put salt in their wounds and continued to whip them. Their blood poured from the earth of their flesh, like the deep, troubled dream of nêhiyaw-iskwêw on the eve of the legendary troubles. Their hands loosened, they covered themselves no more, bodies limp, unable to hold the water of old dreaming horses. They cried, unable to find comfort. Kiskawayak, we wear it. Nimusham always remembered this story. He was there when it happened, Nota told me, that the words of apology would have been empty to Nimusham. It is up to his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, to take off the fabric of skin of the schools and put on new memories, to find the place, to dream the old blue horses of old ancient waters back to the surface. So, it's a poem about truth, but also about, a pathway to reconciliation, right? So, and I also thought, I was thinking this poem is also, it speaks to me because when we think about Truth and Reconciliation Day, National Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is, a good day, obviously, to acknowledge survivors and those who didn't survive. But I think as a lot of us know, TRC Day started off as Orange Shirt Day, right? And Phyllis Webstead, wore her orange shirt on her first day of school and then was stripped of it. And then she was put on the gray uniform of residential school. And so then again, I was thinking, wow, she was forced to take off her grandmother's gifts, the gifts of her nation and her community and her family, and forced to wear, what residential school inflicted again. So again, Neil's poem just kind of spoke to me when it came to Orange Shirt Day. And so when it comes to reconciliation, one definition that I like is actually from Cindy Blackstock, who is the Indigenous children's advocate. And she said for her, reconciliation basically means that every child no longer has to spend their adult years recovering from their childhoods. And that really resonated with me again because, being a child of survivors of residential school, I saw that firsthand, right? All the things that they went through and had to deal with. And so my dad, actually, it's funny too, I was thinking about him because the last time I talked to my dad, he had actually driven from Saskatchewan to Regina with me and with my daughter, who was really small at the time. I think she was about 4. And I had to go to this conference in Regina. And my dad was retired, and so he's like, oh, I'll come with you and help, and I'll look after, your daughter, Danica. So anyway, so we were driving, and we're just chatting. And then at one point, he just said, and he'd been through the whole IAP hearings, telling his story, all of that stuff, right? And he had never actually shared a word of that with me either. It wasn't something that he wanted us to know. But anyway, we're driving, and he just said out of the blue, he said, I chose to go back to residential school because I had a choice at one point. He said, I could have went to the day school or I could have went to residential school. And I told my grandfather that I wanted to go back to residential school. And it was like him still trying to reconcile with what had happened to him and also still blaming himself. And so I just told him, I was like, Dad, I'm like, you were just a little boy. You picked what you knew. You didn't know that this other school was going to be different, you know, and he kind of nodded his head. And it really felt like a moment of reconciliation. Like he needed to tell me that, and he needed to hear that, and he needed that forgiveness for himself. So anyway, so, you know, it is a, reconciliation is tough for those of us who know the truth, and who have lived these experiences. And, you know, and I think just standing with people and hearing their truth is really important when it comes to being good relatives with one another. So I want to talk a little bit now just about the TRC and what it says about reconciliation, because obviously it says a lot. We have the 94 calls to action, and the first 42 focus on the legacy, just the legacy of residential schools, right? The intergenerational legacy. So I've kind of given you some stories to demonstrate, you know, just within my own family, its impact. But, you know, it had a huge, this impact is magnified, right? Across individuals, across families, across communities, across nations. And we're still dealing with it. And the TRC really took that seriously and said there's 42 things that we specifically have to do in all of these really broad areas like child welfare, education, justice, health, in order to address this legacy, right? So that's what those 42 calls are. And I'm not going to go through all of the different things that are being done or have been done. There's been some good things that have been done to meet those calls, but of course, we still have a ways to go. But the second half of the calls were supposed to focus on reconciliation. And from the TRC perspective, what's really needed for reconciliation is actually to change the structures, to decolonize, to change the structures that we operate under and the structure between First Nations and the Crown. And this is where we come back to treaties from my perspective, and even the TRC also mentions this. So the framework for reconciliation, according to the TRC, is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and all of the articles that it lays out. And the UN Declaration also supports the treaty relationship and the honoring of treaties, the affirmation of treaties. And the TRC itself also has calls to action on treaties, and it also sets out the affirmation of treaties as part of what's necessary for actually having a better relationship, I guess you could say, a more respectful relationship between Indigenous peoples in the Crown, but also between all peoples, right? And to be sure that our institutions and our structures reflect these better relations. And so when it comes to the treaty relationship, the TRC is very clear that that's what we need is a treaty relationship. And RCAP also pointed to this as well. So what is it about the treaty relationship that the TRC wants us to implement, right? And from the Office of the Treaty Commissioner perspective, when we talk about the treaty relationship, we're really talking about the spirit and intent of treaty. Because there's a relationship that is supposedly based on, that some people like to say is the treaty relationship, that's grounded in the pieces of paper, in the written text of the treaty. But what's in the written text does not reflect what was actually negotiated during treaties, and that's where the spirit and intent comes in. because there's a lot of issues with the text. There's a really good book out there. It's called No Surrender, The Land Remains Indigenous by Sheldon Krasowski, who really looked at the cede and surrender clauses in the treaty text and all of the different contexts and historical records, eyewitness accounts around treaty making to say that there was a deliberate there were deliberate practices and processes that were put in place to ensure that First Nations actually didn't know what was in the treaty texts, because they would never have ever agreed to surrender or cede the land. So there's that discourse, which hopefully will move more to the center of public understanding, because it's the truth. And also the other truth is the spirit and intent of treaties is what we call it. And this is where the spiritual and contextual foundation of treaties comes in. So before First Nations people made treaties with the Crown, they had a whole bunch of treaties amongst themselves, or we had a whole bunch of treaties amongst ourselves. And so we had been doing treaty making for a very long time, and it was very much a part of our Indigenous laws. And so some of the core legal doctrines that treaty is based on and the treaty relationship is based on, I'm sure some of you know them. Has anyone ever read Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan? All right, great book, lays out all these doctrines if you want to, have a resource. Although the book is just an outline, but it's a good starting point. You can take that and you can explore it further and apply it to your life, and also, build those relationships with communities, build those relationships with elders, and ask them about these doctrines, and they'll be happy to expand on them for you. So in this book are doctrines like Pimatisuwin, which is basically life or a way of life. It's also translated as culture. And so basically, under the treaties, the treaty negotiators were definitely of the point of view that their ways of life would be protected. But they also saw value and respected, diverse ways of being and knowing. And so from the point of view of the treaties, it was really about how can we coexist together in peace and harmony so that we truly build the best world we can on these lands. And there's other doctrines that support that too, like wiya-iskwêw, which literally means to live together in peace and harmony. There was also this understanding of wakotwin, which means interrelatedness. Some people also translate it as kinship, or this idea that we're all related, we're all relatives, right? And so again, there's this real sense of like, if this is the circle, we need to figure out how you fit into it. And so equality, again, was a big part of the treaty relationship. So it was never about, one crown having sovereignty over First Nations. That's very much a colonial relationship. So these are the kinds of things that elders mean when they talk about the treaty relationship. But I want to go back to Pimatisuwin, because life was infused in the treaty relationship in terms of ways of life were meant to be protected and were meant to inform, the dialogue and negotiation around treaties going forward. But treaties themselves were a living relationship that required constant nurturing and negotiation. But the treaties are also regarded as giving life for everybody. And Anna probably heard me say this already, because I mentioned this at our last Treaty Learning Journey conference. But we have this old kateya elder that just passed away this year, Jacob Bill. He was 101 years old, and he was actually the last surviving elder that was interviewed for the book Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan. And we had the opportunity to speak with him last year before he, when he was still with us in this world. And he really stressed Pimatisawan and life. And he said, one of the first things he said was, the treaties are for everyone. And he stressed again that the treaties were made. What he said was, the sun directs them. The buffalo direct them. The wind, the water, they govern the treaties. So not the other way around. And he said they run them. And he said, so when we break treaties, we're not respecting the life of all of these things. So, again, very adamant that Pimatisawan life is very important as well to the treaty relationship. And again, it was supposed to protect all life, because that's the other thing too, like, treaties are also made with all of creation. And so it's not really just about the Crown and First Nations or even Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. It's about all living beings. So, animals, plants, and that sort of thing as well. Everything in creation. And that's the life also that he was talking about. So, so that's a very important doctrine. And again, I just wanted to stress that. So I'll end soon, but I just wanted to say mention one other doctrine that I think is important that the elders talk about, and that is also really reflected in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. One of the doctrines that the elders talk about is miskasawan, which basically means finding your sense of origin, finding your sense of belonging, finding your center. It's also been translated as finding yourself. And so they talked about the need to restore among First Nations people a positive sense of origin and belonging, which means things like reconnecting with creation stories, and having that positive and respectful view of First Nations culture and history, and also being guided by your center. And I find it really interesting that the book, according to that book, the center is the land. So, lots of relationships there, right, and connections. But the TRC is also really clear that, when they made the pronouncement of cultural genocide, it's an English phrase, but what does it really mean, right? What's the real impact again? And towards that, in the 6th volume of the book, they actually call the final section of chapter 6. Did I say the book? It's the 6th volume of the TRC report. Their last section is called "We Are All Treaty People." And in it, and this is also in Murray Sinclair's autobiography. So I think he may have actually wrote that last section. And he talks about these really important questions of that go to the core of who you are and your understanding of yourself, and that, this is what cultural genocide tried to destroy through the processes of cultural genocide that were instituted at Indian residential schools. That these are the questions that went unfulfilled for survivors. And so those questions are, the fundamental ones that we all need, right? In order to have miskasawan, to find our center, our sense of belonging, where we're going. So the questions are, where do I come from? Yeah, so La Savage, right? Taking of the orange shirt and all the gifts of your grandmothers. Where am I going? It's pretty hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you come from. Why am I here? And then these three questions feed into the big question that's always changing for each of us, which is, who am I? You know? So that sense of yourself, right? So to me, these are also what the elders were talking about when it came to Miskasawin, and what they were really hoping would be upheld under the treaty relationship as well, because they identified it as one of the core doctrines of treaty that needed to be part of the treaty relationship. So I'll just leave you, I want to leave with one quote from the TRC where they define what they call true reconciliation. And they say that it can only take place through a reshaping of a shared national collective memory of who we are and what has come before. But they're really hopeful, and they say the youth of this country are taking up this challenge. So I told you about the story of my dad. And I have to finish that story because, anyway, I'll just finish it. So we get to Regina and check into our hotel room, and I had brought one change of clothes for my daughter. I don't know what I was thinking, but anyway, and I told my dad, I said, if she doesn't wear these tomorrow, she's gonna have to wear her pajamas because she doesn't have any other clothes to wear, right? And he's like, okay. And then anyway, whatever, we went and ate and then went to bed and woke up in the morning, and I had to leave right away, and my daughter slept in. And then her and my dad went to the museum and just kind of I don't know, whatever. They just kind of bummed around Regina for the day. And then, so I was at the conference, and it's this big conference hall, and we're all standing there, and my dad walks in with my daughter. It was like towards the end of the conference. And I remember I was standing with a couple of women. One of them was a good friend, and she goes, hey, there's your dad. She goes, oh, she said, your daughter's wearing pajamas. And I was like, and then so I asked my dad, I'm like, why is she wearing her pajamas? And he said, well, you said if she didn't want to wear these clothes, she could wear her pajamas. And I said, that's not what I said, but okay. But I kind of thought, he's going to let her wear what she wants to wear. So, yeah. So anyway, I thought that was a good one. But I also said that was the last time I talked to my dad, because soon after that, he actually had a health issue where he ended up, his aorta tore in 2 places, and he ended up being hospitalized for 18 months, but he couldn't speak or move. He was like basically paralyzed from the chest down, and there was something where, he couldn't speak. And so that just kind of makes the story more precious. But I also feel like it was his way. It was also a gift for us. It was very difficult for him, but it was a gift for us because we were able to resolve and, again, reconcile a lot of things and speak about a lot of things because he couldn't move. And we could talk to him and share things with him, and we knew he was listening, and because he was still fully conscious and stuff like that. And it's also really interesting because when he was a little boy, the name that he was given, his nêhiyaw name, was actually Asiniawasas, which means stone boy. So it was kind of interesting that for the last part of his life, he kind of became like a stone, and someone that we could share stories with and that sort of thing. So anyway, maybe I'll just stop there. But I just want to say again, in keeping with, I guess, this theme of wearing it, kisquaweyak, we wear it. And this is how we truly clothe ourselves in the hopes and dreams of our treaty ancestors. Okay, thank you.